Yo, so today I'm going to fire off my opinions on the Resident Evil remakes, and I'm going to try and rank them in order for you. The order of my list is my opinion, so you may agree with what I say or you may disagree, but I guess that's all part of the fun. If you disagree, I'll gladly tell you why you're wrong in the comment section below, so if you want to argue it out with me, drop a comment and let's get it on. But in all seriousness, this is a game series that needs no introduction. It started off as a survival horror franchise, and then it eventually ventured out into being more of an action game, and then had a bit of an identity crisis. We've had a remake of the original way back in the day, we've had a few more remakes in recent years, so here's how I think they stack up against each other. And we kick off the list with number 4, we got Resident Evil 3. This pick it's not going to be surprising to anyone who's come across this video. What may be surprising is I actually really enjoy this game for what it is. I don't have this big sentimental attachment to the original game, and on top of that, the remake of 2 was more of a reimagining than a faithful recreation anyway, so when they're talking about taking these creative liberties with Resident Evil 3, I'm kind of fine with it. The controls are tight and the new dodge mechanic's really cool to pull off, and the whole survival horror conserve your ammo sort of thing with the backtracking, it's really stripped back in this game as it all takes a bit of a backseat to a more action heavy approach. I kind of really enjoy this game for all the other reasons why people hate it. I love the focus on the action gameplay, the tight linear structure, and it just kind of funnels you through the game at this really incredible pace for the most part. The puzzles in this game are just there to break up the action and provide some quiet time. The game does give the player a handful of cool areas that you can explore, so you do actually get some of that classic Resident Evil gameplay snuck in there, like sandbox area, but it's a bit more bite-sized in this game. The story is a bit of a weak point, and it's just filled with these action movie style coincidences that keep our main protagonist alive. I do like Jill and Carlos as characters in this game though, and I'm actually in the minority that enjoys Nemesis too. So before you act like a Resident Evil 4 villager and grab the pitchfork, just listen to me take please. We've had Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake. I don't think that 2 Resident Evil games back to back really need that same stalker enemy. I appreciate Nemesis in the fact that it works differently than Mr. X. Every time Nemesis is on screen, you can tell that some crazy action is about to go down. It's a nice contrast to the Stalker that we had in the previous game. Mr. X provides the horror in the horror game, Nemesis provides a spectacle in the action game. For me personally, I think that it's a pretty cool change. The reason why this game isn't higher on the list is because even though I enjoy the ride, I much prefer the classic Resident Evil formula to this game. As an action game, it's serviceable, but it also lacks the depth and the variety in its enemy encounters to keep things interesting. Not to mention, the gore has been downgraded, so shredding a zombie to bits and watching limbs fall off just doesn't happen in this game the same way it does in Resident Evil 2 Remake. So, in terms of remakes, it feels like this is a bit of a step back and doesn't really aim to build much on the original. I still enjoyed my time with it, but I honestly can't place it any higher on this list. There's not much to say about it other than it's a short but thrilling ride that ultimately doesn't live up to the other game standards, but it's a decent enough experience on its own merit. And number 3, we got Resident Evil 2. So, I honestly didn't think the RPD would translate over well into this over-the-shoulder view, and was proven horribly wrong. Part of me still wants Capcom to cook up something in terms of a fixed camera perspective and tank controls for this game, but I also realise that today's audience would reject the control scheme due to how standardised control mapping is these days. But yeah, I waited years for this game and the wait was totally worth it. The game managed to have really sublime controls, but also maintaining the tension of classic survival horror, which you don't really think that's going to be a combination that works too well, but in this game it really paid off. We have 2 campaigns, 1 starring Leon and 1 starring Claire, and they actually play out quite differently whilst not requiring the scenario A and B of the original Resident Evil 2. The scenarios are still pretty much there, but they don't change much in terms of story or the items that you collect. It's very much the biggest downgrade that this game receives when compared to the original game. For those who don't know, the original Resident Evil 2 had a zapping system, where if you picked up certain items with one character in your A scenario, they would be absent for the other character when you play the B scenario, and this is totally absent in the Resident Evil 2 remake, and it just kind of takes away that little bit of identity what the original had, and that extra layer of strategy when you were playing the game. But on its own merits, it's outstanding. The visuals on display are top notch, and Capcom clearly poured a lot of love into recreating the RPD. This game made zombies cool again. Well, at least for a while. And I'd say the biggest improvement when it comes to this game aside from the visuals is Mr. X. Mr. X commands your respect and attention every time he's on screen. He's an absolute unit, mate. He was chasing me through corridors whilst I'm trying to scavenge for items. Like, it just really heightened the tension because it forced me to make mistakes, and I ended up taking damage from zombies I wouldn't usually take damage from. Just sit there and cry in a corner like a little bitch whilst Mr. X's footsteps just kind of stomped towards me and there's nothing I could do. This game really did scratch that survival horror itch. It had the ammo conservation, backtracking, resource scavenging, exploration, unlocking new areas and solving puzzles. It was just really incredible. So yeah, the story, it is what it is. It's good enough, and I really do enjoy the cast of characters, and they used the original Resident Evil 2 game as more of a template with this one and created more of a reimagining than a one-to-one remake. So all in all, there's not much what I can say to criticise this game. It was just absolutely fantastic and I really enjoyed my time with it. Number 2, we got Resident Evil 4 Remake. This game is actually insane. Resident Evil 4 is one of my favourite games of all time. This remake doesn't have the luxury of being the big technical jump as the other PS4 remakes, but what it does do is build upon the foundation that the original game laid for it. This game is more of a reimagining too. There's some places that are instantly recognisable because they're near one-to-one recreations of the original areas, but other areas will keep the same design philosophy as the original, but the area layouts will be totally different. So it's cool because sometimes I knew exactly where I was because the landmarks and the gameplay scenarios were identifiable from the original game, but the actual level layout was completely different. Just did mad things to my brain where like, this is so familiar but so new at the same time. The controls are top tier. This is a take no prisoners action showcase of a game. Context sensitive melee moves, precision aiming, excellent movement and freedom. This game has a freaking parry mechanic. It just makes shooting through waves of enemies like a real joy to play. It did strip back a lot of the personality from the original game, but it's never really too detrimental to the overall game experience. They managed to tell the story in a new and different way, which is still engaging. Ashley in the original game has a really underrated character arc, but a character arc in this game I'd say is brought more to the forefront, and it's going to resonate a lot more with people this time round. The treasures are there to be discovered. We've got the extra DLC to play through, and honestly I love this game so much I could just sit here and gush over it all day. I appreciate it when games lean into their absurdity. Why the hell is there a merchant who just sets up a shop for you all over this village? What the hell is he doing with all these shooting ranges? We've got typewriters scattered everywhere to save your game. You combine stupid emblems together to act as keys to open locked doors. It still has some of the classic Resident Evil in its DNA, and it's stupid, it makes no sense, but it's consistent to the game world and it never hinders the experience. It juggles that fine line between being totally out there and ridiculous but grounded in reality, and very few games can strike that balance, but Resident Evil 4 Remake accomplishes it. It's just a lot of fun. When it's that stupid but that realistic at the same time, and you get to the point where you just accept it as like one universe, it's just sick. You end up not even questioning it. Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake could really be interchangeable on this list depending on if you want to play an action game or a survival horror title. But as it stands, and how I'm feeling today, at the time of recording this video, Resident Evil 4 is the better game of the two, and that's why it's number 2 on the list. And number 1 on the list should not really be a surprise to people, because we've got Resident Evil 1 Remake. Widely regarded as the best remake of any game period, I have to say Resident Evil 1 Remake has rendered the original game obsolete in my eyes. There are few games that I consider perfect in their design, but Resident Evil 1 Remake is certainly one of them. Games usually age more gracefully for me when they focus on puzzles and exploration. A lot of game mechanics can get out of date really quick, and people have this belief that that happened with fixed camera angles and tank controls, but for me, tank controls and fixed camera angles go hand in hand to create this striking visual presentation that can't really be captured effectively without combining the two. This is more of a classic survival horror take than any of the other remakes, and this game builds on the original in every single way. I'd say the voice acting is more improved, the world is more detailed, graphics are superior. Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 1 Remake were released quite close to each other all things considered, and the jumping quality is staggering. I adore the cinematic presentation of the fixed camera angles. It's a cool visual design choice what helps frame shots, it hides enemies off screen, and it also acts as a visual aid. Backtracking back and forth through this mansion and learning the level layout is really rewarding, and you get that sense of familiarity. Carefully managing your resources and avoiding certain hallways and rooms you think are problematic are all things that we experience when we play Resident Evil 1 Remake for the first time. The cool thing about this game too is the introduction of the Crimson Head zombies. Anyone who was familiar with the original game on PS1 were caught by surprise when these things jumped out and started laying waste to you. But I keep one as a pet in this room now. His name's Steve, by the way. Say hello to Steve in the comments and drop him a like. This game is less about slaying enemies since the combat is a bit more simplistic. It's really about uncovering the mysteries of the mansion and overcoming the various roadblocks that are in your way. There are times when you can engage in combat, but it's a bit simplistic, and the combat is less of a skill check and more of a decision from the player. Do you want to eliminate this enemy to make life easier, or do you avoid it to conserve your ammo? It's more of a strategic move than a skill check. I also like the fact the character is stationary as you aim. Games don't have to simulate real life accurately. You trade your ability to move for the ability to deal damage. The zombies keep pressing forward and the mechanics work well together to form this really balanced gameplay loop. This game is a masterpiece and will continue to age gracefully. I can have no other spot for this game than numero uno. Whilst I can go back and forth in my head about Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake, I can only ever see Resident Evil 1 Remake at the top of this list. This game pretty much defines the Resident Evil series for me. It's a definitive title that captures the original formula. So yeah, Resident Evil Remake is number one. Not much negative to say about the game other than the textures are blurry, but other than that, beautifully designed game.
Resident Evil